Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Voter Suppression in the 19th Century North, the Other Disenfranchisement and What It Tells Us About Voter Rights Today. I'm joined tonight by Gregory Downs, Professor of History at the University of California at Davis. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center. I'm always pleased to see so many names from across the country in our session tonight. It seems like we've got folks from literally all corners of the country, from Three Rivers, California to Sebastian, Florida, from Houston, Texas, up to Shaker Heights, Illinois. And I think it's a real benefit for us to have such a wide geographic representation, partly because I think the lens with which you see tonight's content from your home communities, from your region, from your state, from your schools, only helps us better understand these connections. And I think tonight's title in some ways really is a good illustration of what we aim to do for each of our sessions. That is, use the humanities as a tool, something in this case from the past that helps us understand today and current issues. If you can't hear my voice tonight at any point, please start by logging out. Turn the session off, come back in. 99.9% of the time that seems to solve problems that may occur. If things get staticky or if my voice fades in and out, if you can't quite hear Professor Downs the right way, that's the best place to start. I'd also encourage you to use these first few minutes as I do my introduction as a way to you adjust your volume and gauge the connection that you might have, and hopefully get yourself into a place where you're comfortable with the sound and with the conversation that we're about to have. As always, I'd like to thank and acknowledge my team at the National Humanities Center. Libby Taylor, our Education Programs Coordinator, is the primary contact with our scholars to develop the readings and the PowerPoint that you'll have access tonight. If you have any questions about the webinar series in general, Libby's the person to start with, and I would encourage you to use the email address provided to reach out to her. That includes, by the way, getting on waiting lists. If you go to our session registration page, you'll see that most of our sessions right now are sold out, but I appreciate the thoughtfulness of some of you who have conflicts come up and then withdraw from the seat that you've registered for, therefore opening up some seats. And when that happens, Libby always adds names from our waiting list. So if there's anything on that list that you can't get into, but you'd really like to be in, shoot her an email and she'll handle that waiting list in a manual fashion. I also want to acknowledge Mike Williams, who's the Education Projects Manager. It's Mike's primary responsibility is our online course catalog, but of course you'll also hear him on occasion leading a webinar and certainly involved in a whole variety of other connections that we like to make between educators and scholars. One thing the three of us do have in common is that all of us were in the classroom. Combined, we taught about 27 years of middle and high school grades education. So for us, it's very important to support and recognize the leadership and the passion and the dedication of all of you for being here, and all the work that we do. We really keep in the front of our mind how helpful and how relevant it can be for professional educators on a daily basis. And really, I think that's what we try to do at the National Humanities Center. While the center itself for the last 43 years has primarily functioned to support humanities scholarship in the form of a fellowship program, it's our education programs that really connect that knowledge and that content, that process of understanding the humanities to the classroom. We work with K-12 classrooms certainly, but also with community college and university level classrooms. And it's our intent to infuse all of what we do, all the best practices of humanities education, with that deep scholarly understanding and any kind of emerging understanding that we can use sources and evidence and inquiry to ask our students to investigate in the same way. A couple of quick reminders about our webinars. As many of you have done so far, the chat box at the bottom of the Go to Training control panel is your active lifeline to the conversation that Professor Downs and I will have tonight. So please use that to introduce yourself, to share where you're from, and it's also a place to ask questions of the session tonight. So if anything needs clarification, or if you'd like to explore something in a little bit more in-depth way, please register your question. My job then as the moderator is to bring those questions into the conversation, and I can almost always get to all of your questions. It's also a place though to chat between each other, so don't hesitate to make a comment or respond to someone else directly. or to maybe even ask your own question of the room, particularly in ways that your classrooms may integrate the kind of content that we're going to share tonight. Our webinars are, as I noted, mostly sold out at this point. We've reached the capacity of 200. Again, I would encourage all of you to be graceful if something comes up and you signed up for a webinar several months ago, and as it turns out, you've got soccer practice or too much grading, or you don't feel well, or you just didn't get home in time. If you know that you're not going to be able to make it, please go ahead and withdraw from your seat so we can activate that waiting list. Right now, we only have 3 sessions that have any seats available. Right before I logged on, I checked, and next week's session with Patrick Balls, titled Unlikely Muses, A Marriage of Mathematics and Poetry, still has 11 seats available. We just sold out, literally just a few moments ago, we sold out of David Chappelle's session. But next spring, we have a session with Scott DeVoe at University of Virginia. Right now, there's 17 seats left in that session. For those of you who have attended all of the sessions that you've registered for, we'd like to offer you a VIP session. That means that if you sign up for and attend every single session, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. If you attend every session you've registered for, whether that's 1 session or 10 sessions, you will receive a hidden link to one or both of the special VIP webinars that we have scheduled. In early January, we'll be working with Mark Aronson and Marina Burros in New Jersey on the barbaric legacy of sugar, and in particular, the way that it fits into the 1619 project. And end of next spring, we'll be working with Carolyn Denard from Georgia State University on the life and writings of Toni Morrison. So in order to get access to those webinars, all you have to do is show up for what you signed up for, which may be even more incentive to pull your registration to back out if something comes up and you can't make it. Of course, I'd also like to remind you of all the other free and available materials that we have for your use in your classroom. In terms of instructional resources, this includes certainly lesson plans that are designed to be differentiated and available for all levels, primary source collections, essays, podcasts, other kinds of media. It also includes, though, online courses. We currently have 3 online courses this fall. We'll add another 4 to our catalog next spring. Right now, we have 2 courses that are available and open for registration. One is titled Suckers and Swindlers in American History and looks at the deep and long legacy of fraud and swindling in American capitalist history. Registration is currently open, and it's very involved with looking at sources and evidence and archives to track that sort of role of fraud all the way back to P.T. Barnum and eventually up to Bernie Madoff. And secondly, we have a course titled Oyster in the City that uses foodways to explore the 20th century American urban landscape, regulatory landscape, and the ways that the oyster in particular gives us a lens to the environmental landscape of the turn of the century, 20th century America. Registration is currently open for both of those courses. They're heavily based on archives and source work, and they're both aided by the contributions of former fellows and current scholars. Finally, particularly for those of you in the Los Angeles area, I'd like to note a weekend in March, early March, that our education team will be traveling to Southern California to co-facilitate a session at the Huntington Library. Registration isn't quite open yet, but once it does, I'll make sure that it's available to everyone, both in our webinars and through our constant contact email list. This 1.5 to 2 day session, I think it's a Friday and a Saturday, will be located at the Huntington, and everyone in Southern California, I would love to finally meet you face to face and have you be a part of this, this very important conversation. Finally, I'd like to thank our Teacher Advisory Council. That includes several names that I see in our attendees list tonight, including Jedediah Anderson. It's really important for us, again, to maintain a relevant connection to the classroom. It's important for us at the National Humanities Center to use the contributions and the advice and the evaluations of this very skilled and very professional and very diverse educator team. I want to thank all of them for the past 4 years for being a part of this this process, and I'd like to encourage all of you who are interested in working a little bit more closely with us to look out for the application process next spring. So that's my introduction to the center. Again, I would encourage you to stay connected with us, and not just through our webinars, but through the other various activities that we have planned. I think our online courses in particular would give you a really immersive way to work side by side with scholars in archives and with sources to better understand the way they do their work. That's my way of segueing to introduction tonight. Greg Downs is a professor of history at University of California in Davis. And again, our session tonight is primarily titled Voter Suppression in the 19th Century North, which I hope for many of you is a little bit jarring. Greg, you should be able to hear me now out there in Davis. Can you hear me, Greg?
I sure can.
Fantastic. I want to thank you for being here, particularly on Pacific Coast time. I know it's at the end of your day as well, work after work for you. But I did note that in your bio on the UC Davis website that you recently earned the 2018 UC Davis Public Service Award. So this is your way, I think, of continuing that connection and doing it on a much more national level.
Well, yes, thank you for that. I'm delighted to be here. And I myself taught 4 years of junior high school and high school before I went back to graduate school and eventually became a professor. So I have
wait a minute.
These trainings.
Yeah, hold on one second, Professor. So you just took the credibility survey through the roof by saying that. And it's true, right? I mean, you know it again from both sides of this conversation that being collegial and being professional, teachers are experts at what they do. You're an expert scholar, and together we can do innovative things. But if you've been in the classroom, standing with and in front of kids, that really speaks highly of, I think, the conversation we're about to have.
Well, I'm really always excited for the opportunity to talk with classroom teachers, and I know so much of the work of helping our next generation of soon-to-be adults understand the relationship between the past and present and history and their role as participants in today's society depends upon those elementary school, middle school, and high school teachers. We're lucky to see the products of some of your teaching in our classes, at Davis and at other places. It's really exciting to see students who are increasingly, I think, familiar with primary sources, with alternative narratives of history, and some of the exciting things that are going on at the classroom level in history across the country today.
Well, Professor, I've given you the control of the slides so that you can advance it. I'm going to be watching the chat box, and I invite you to do it as well. But you will notice that Leslie Mace from Durham, North Carolina, gave you lots of points, but Brendan Ivey from LA gave you big points. So go ahead, take it away.
The next 5 minutes. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, Andy, for having me and for all the staff at National Humanities Center, which is a great institution. And thank you all for taking your time. I know that for some of you, it's really the end of your day, and so I appreciate the time you're taking. I'm going to try and keep an eye on the text box so that if there are questions that come up that I can segue and address, that I can do it, and I know that Andy will be helping with that also. Conversely, if in taking a segue to address a question, I don't come back to where I was before the segue, please note that, and I'll look to keep tying the pieces together. So what I'm interested in talking about today, let's see, I think I just clicked to go forward. Here we go. In talking about today is a set of questions that help us to understand a chart like this. You've probably seen similar charts. It's a little outdated at this point, in part because it takes so long for organizations to compile voting information from many different countries. But where you see the United States, although voter participation has been going up in the 10 years since this data, but generally running behind most of the nations that people think of as comparable with the United States in terms of education level and other measures of comparability. A few of them at the top, my students are always like, what's going on in Chile? And that gets to the question of compulsory voting, which is a different question than how the United States compares with nations that have voluntary voting, but equal or higher levels. And it's especially an interesting question when we ask, why does the United States have a relatively low level of voter participation? Today, when we look at charts, let's see how I do at advancing it, like this. in which we can see this chart, for reasons I'll come back to, is also kind of misleading. And don't worry, I won't be overwhelming you with numbers today, though I'm glad to try and get into it. But this plot of turnout of eligible men in presidential elections shows extraordinarily high participation in the 1830s, 1840s. It is, I think, universally believed that the United States had not only the highest voter participation in the world at that period, but by huge margins. And in fact, as I'll get to in a minute, even the early part of the graph that looks low might actually be misleading us about how high participation was in the period between the 1780s and 1820s. So that's one way of framing the question that I'm going to ask. How does a nation that had been the leading nation for voter participation fall to a position over the 20th century where it trails many of the nations that we think of as comparable? And you can see in this graph some of the different places where some of these drops start to come. And I'll show you some other graphs that also try and estimate some of these. That there's something happening at some key points that I'll touch on today in the 1840s, 1850s. The drop during the Civil War is related to something else. And then there's significant drops in the 1880s and 1890s. So these lead us to two ways of thinking about contributing factors to the relative decline in voter participation. Now at this point, Andy, oh, there we go. My arrow had disappeared in voter participation. But before I go into that, it is also worth noting that these graphs always are going to look different depending on what you're comparing to. The previous chart compared to eligible voters, which means essentially white men. So among eligible voters, a lot of them turned out in the early 19th century, and that has declined dramatically over the course of the nation's history. But of course, as you can see in this graph, as a percentage of the total population, the voting chart looks quite different. And that's because of the extraordinary impact, the single largest enfranchisement in US history, something that doesn't take place in the 19th century at all, of course, but in the 20th, and the expansion of suffrage to women, the product of 70 years and more of activist struggle that led to success at territories and states in the late 19th century, and then on the national level in the 19th Amendment in the early 20th. So it is important to keep both of those graphs in your head. As a percentage of total voters, the US sees a decline, even though voters as a percentage of the population is much higher than it had been in the past. One of the key answers to this question, and this is almost the last graph you're going to get, if for better or for worse, one of the key answers to this has been the United States extraordinary, in some ways almost unprecedented, disfranchisement campaign of Jim Crow, of the effort to exclude African American voters in the South from voting, an effort that begins in the 1870s and really takes on a different level in 1890 for reasons we'll come back to, and that between 1890 and the early 19-teens, all but destroys African American male participation in elections. There remain small numbers of voters, especially in some cities and some other places, but African American participation, as you'll see, drops more than 90% in a number of southern states and more than 95% in others. Some of the upper South and border states, it's a little bit different. And this remains an extraordinarily important part of the US story. In no way what I'm presenting today is meant to dislodge that from the center of the US story. But if you look here, we pulled out the Talking Points memo people when they published mine, pulled out the Southern numbers. And you can see how staggering the decline in voter participation in the South is over the late 19th and early 20th century. It's the green line there. And there's no way to miss it. But if you look above at the light purple line, the non-South, you might notice that even though it's at a higher level, it's almost the same graph. And that decline in Northern voter turnout over, taking place in some levels around the 1840s to 1850s, and then also steeply between 1890 and the 1920s and 30s, gives us another way of understanding where voter participation went. And my argument is that to understand how the particular situation the United States is in today, we have to understand also that part of the story. Why Northern participation declined? Because as you can see, as we get closer to 2000 in this graph, the South is nearly equaling the North in voter participation in the aftermath of the 1965 Voting Rights Acts and other movements of registration and expansion. And yet they're meeting not in a place of the prior high levels, but at a much lower level than before, which suggests that we have two things that are really driving a downward turn in voter participation in the United States. One is the particular Southern legal disfranchisement campaigns, but the other is something else. And that something else, I want to argue, is the story of what happens in the North over the course of the 19th century and how to make sense of the ways that those processes, especially those processes, shape the way we vote today. In essence, the two key innovations that I'm interested in that had the impact of diminishing voter participation that we can lose in the focus on Jim Crow are things that we take for granted. And that's how we determine who can vote, not in terms of the law, but what's the process, and the transformative impact of registration. Voter registration, something that we take for granted now in many respects, but that was not in place in most northern states early in the 19th century, and that was put in place, as we'll talk about, specifically to attack immigrant participation in voting, and that had the effect of starting to drive down in that 1840s era voter participation in the North. And the other innovations that the North is making coterminous, these are coterminous with those in the South, are about how people vote and the introduction of a ballot that looks familiar to us, the Australian ballot. Now, if we think about those two things as having just had a devastating impact on voter turnout, and also being things that continue to define our voting system, I think we're going to get a little closer to the answer of how is it that on the particular question of voter turnout in the South and Jim Crow disfranchisement, the Voting Rights Act was in many ways successful. Many other parts of the responses to the Civil Rights Act turned out to have much more mitigated or limited impacts. But voting rights had a particularly successful resolution of that drove the South to approach Northern numbers. And yet it didn't resolve the problem of why the United States had an overall level of voter participation. And the answer to that, I think, as I said, lies in these other legacies of disfranchisement, especially in the North, of registration, and of what we call the Australian ballot, the kind of ballot that resembles those we use today.
Hey, Greg, can I ask you a quick question, quick clarifying question? And I'm going to actually go back a slide to ask this.
Do it.
And I'm also thinking now of our audience and the ways that they might represent some of these themes to their younger students, really of any age. Sometimes it's easy for us to use geographic terms or even cultural terms like South and non-South, North. Tell me, when you say the South, what do you mean? And when you say the North, what do you mean? What geographic or maybe even state? I don't want you to tick through all the states, but just give us a general definition of what we're talking about.
Well, it's a good and, as you know, perplexing question, especially for people with roots along the edges of different regions. My family is from Kentucky, and so there's a long and active debate about whether Kentucky is actually Southern or not Southern and things like that. But what generally, when people are looking at in 19th century terms, they're either defining it around states that continue to have slavery after 1830, or at times people will use it as coterminous with the Confederacy. I try not to do that because I do think that Kentucky, especially, and to lesser degrees Maryland, Missouri, are Southern states, even though they're not Confederate states. And I'm specifically interested in the states that establish legal regimes of disfranchisement as preludes to legal statewide regimes of Jim Crow segregation. So there's many forms, as we talk about in, in other contexts, of white supremacy and of ways of structuring racial power. And those are important, many of which spread across the country in different ways and different forms. But there remains in the 19th and into the mid-20th century a particular set of regimes in most southern states of disfranchisement and Jim Crow segregation. The South versus the North, or the non-South. In the 19th century, I'm primarily looking at the drivers of these forms of registration and the Australian ballot tend to be northeastern states, in part because, as you'll see, what they're responding to is the influx of immigrants, especially Catholic immigrants, especially the Irish in the 1830s to the 1850s, and then Southern and Eastern European immigrants in the late 19th century. And so those tend to be the places that innovate these other forms. The southern states will eventually copy them. Now virtually every state operates with some form of a registration policy, pre-registration to vote, and something akin to a Australian ballot, a ballot you mark rather than, as I'll talk about, being given by someone else. Does that help?
Yeah, I think it does. And then without going too far sideways, because I know we have a tight time, if we use the term non-South, particularly 20th century, are there regions of the non-South that are more or less influential? So would California be as or not as important as considering the Dakotas, for example? Are there, does it break down in that kind of geography, or do we just kind of, is it safe to just kind of call everything the non-South as you watch that graph move towards 2000?
So it's a good question. So yeah, inevitably, I have two daughters who are in middle school, and they always say that the word they long to hear, that they hate to hear more than any other, is it's complicated. It's as the sort of default way that historians respond to questions like those. Yes, it's absolutely true that if you start to, especially you're asking, as I understand it, about more contemporary voting, that you can disaggregate in all kinds of ways. And there are interesting differences in the law. There are a number of Western states that were, far Western coastal states that were innovators in automatic voter registration, which starts to address one of the issues that I'll end up talking about. And there are some other things that cause differences between different parts of, say, the West or the East Coast. Having lived in both New York and California, there's a shocking difference in the ways that the election laws run, even though they're both among the, they have fairly common partisan breakdown. And that leads to pretty striking differences in turnout, not just in the presidential race, but even more so in local elections. There's all kinds of interesting reasons why that would be the case. And when you look at things like women's suffrage, which I know you have programs on, that you can see there's a very particular Plains story that grows out in the Plains and the Rocky Mountain West that alters, our sense of where innovation comes from. For the story that I'm telling about the growth of these two ways of driving down voter turnout, of registration and the Australian ballot, they both germinate from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, that area, though they start to spread quickly. And in fact, by the latter movements, California is moving in pretty quick lockstep with the northeastern states, sometimes in response to the same fears of immigration.
Great. Thank you for defining that for us. And Brennan, I see your question, but I'm going to hold off on that just for a few minutes because I think it might come up. So thank you for illustrating that for us, and I'll go back to where you left off.
So one of the things that I've been really interested to watch, the heart of my research is the Civil War era. One of the things that I've been really interested to watch from a step away is the transformation over the last 10 or 15 years in some basic questions of how democratic or undemocratic the nation was at its founding. For a long time, I was taught, probably many of you were taught, and probably likely is true, many of the books that I get to utilize to teach my students still say, and I suspect many of the ones you say, the United States founded as a republic, then became a democracy. And I find increasingly skeptical of that statement. It suggests, there's the idea that we've gotten a lot of traction on, that the United States, what does it mean to call, say, the 1820s United States a democracy if voting is essentially limited to white men? And that remains a powerful question. Does it even make sense to use the term democracy prior to, say, the 19th Amendment, if you're talking about a majority of the adult population being excluded? But beyond that, something else has happened, which is that was rooted in a vision that an anti-democratic republic was founded in the Constitution, and that it kind of mysteriously became a democracy over the 18 teens to 1830s. There's a little truth to that, but much less, it turns out, than we thought. It is undoubtedly true that, as this quote from John Adams shows, that many members of the Constitutional Convention resisted the idea of mass participation in politics, the presentation of an idea of engagement with voting rights in the Constitution, which was floated at the convention, doesn't get anywhere, and that there is a great deal of resistance to popular movements, popular participation in politics among those people. But it's also true that wide-scale participation in politics predates the revolution, and that many of the colonies, especially those northeastern colonies, have a pretty wide range of participation of white men. So we can emphasize sometimes property requirements, but in fact we get several states that have already, by 1800, eliminated property requirements. We get some other states that have frozen them at rates that they set in the 1720s and 1730s. So the amount of taxable property they require has become something that, with inflation, has become almost irrelevant. You're talking about disfranchising a small number of adult white men. Or the amount of taxes that they require frozen at levels set in the early part of the 1700s and not raised again, disfranchised decreasing numbers of adult white men. In some northeastern states, some African American men are participating. And beyond that, we get another question that we've really struggled to get at, which is, do we know any of these laws were enforced? In fact, there's very little record keeping on what people, on things like whether people had been, were who they said they were, whether they had paid the taxes they said they had paid, whether they had a prior felony conviction somewhere else. So it does seem much more likely that people are voting even if they're not meeting the literal legal thresholds in the 1780s, 1790s. We know this, in fact, because when we look at the participation rates, when we look at the number of people voting in local elections, huge numbers of people are voting as soon as we get records. And one individual, amazingly intrepid researcher named Phil Lampe, went through tens of thousands of documents in order to start to compile these. And over the process showed that, in fact, 1780s, 1790s, you might see 60, 70% adult male turnout in many northern states. And so that the idea that the nation is not is a republic and then becomes a democracy over the 1800s is suspect from that framework too. There's also some interesting oddities of early voting. New Jersey, some of you know, permitted widowed women to vote because they own property, and then that's stricken down. There are a handful of northern states that permit African Americans with property to vote who have those rights taken away, most famously New York, which eliminates property qualifications for white men as it raises them and makes them more extensive for black men. Interestingly, in 1800, most states do not limit voting to citizenship, nor would it have really been feasible. There's no real way of knowing if you're in Framingham or Lexington, Massachusetts, if someone is actually a citizen. And in fact, non-citizen voting will continue for much of the 19th and part of the 20th century. So here's just some information you can pull back to if you're interested in this. I'm not going to go over word for word of this, which is that the estimate that historians have made, you can see this in the Ratcliffe article, is that about 20% of adult white men are disfranchised by property or economic qualifications. So we emphasize those laws, but they have much smaller impact than we think. So there's many more people getting through. What does keep people from voting are residency requirements. Turnout for elections is rising, though it's mostly focused on local elections. And one of the things that confused us for a long time was asking about the presidency, when in fact it's very clear that voters are participating in everything except the elections for presidential electors in much of the early 1800s. But even though they're relatively limited, the impact of laws disfranchising voters for property or economic qualifications, there are very effective laws that say that office holders have to own a sufficient amount of property, or to put up, including, as you can see in South Carolina, enslaved property, or to put up huge bonds in order to hold office. Now, the reason we used to think that there was a first expansion of the vote in the 1820s used to be very tied to the figure of Andrew Jackson. And sometimes it would be told as if Andrew Jackson ushered in a period of popular white democracy. And the reason for this, you can see on the left side of the chart, is that in 1824, when Jackson ran for president in an extremely complex four-way race and lost in the House of Representatives, there were 365,000 votes cast. And in 1828, there's 1.14 million. So if we're looking at presidential elections, this is an incredible leap. And this leap happens exactly as Jackson claims a resounding victory. But there's all kinds of interesting reasons why this happened, and why it doesn't tell us exactly what we think it will tell us. See, I'm waiting for the arrow to come up for my slide, which I can't see. There we go. So one of these reasons is something that sits behind those numbers, which is how many people could vote for directly for presidential electors in 1824 in New York State? 0. 1828, 270,000. Is that because no one wanted to in 1824? No, it's because New York, Georgia, and Louisiana did not permit a popular vote for the election. As the Constitution provides, they selected the electors with state legislators. So one large chunk of that participation jump from 1824 to 28 is simply because those states changed their laws. 2 states continued to not allow popular vote for president in 1828, Delaware and South Carolina. The other seems to be the participation of people who had voted in a lot of local elections, and then what they learned from the Jackson campaign is not to vote at all, but to vote for president also, which seems peculiar to us, but reflects how powerful local politics was in shaping local practices and understandings. And this is related to a question that I see on the side box, and I'll try and come back to it also at the end, which is that it's not a surprise with local voting being so important. It's not a surprise that this is also the period where legislators become extraordinarily effective at what we call gerrymandering. That if you want to, they don't have our computer programs in order to draw districts that are, perfectly gerrymandered the way that contemporary election law and election consultants do. But starting in this period, we see, and with echoes back to practices in England and English practices of rotten boroughs and other ways of disproportionately large and small districts, we see states, allowing districts to be wildly different size. Many states allocate state legislators by county, which means the largest cities will only have as many legislators as rural areas. Other places, we see extraordinarily complex legislative and then congressional maps being drawn in order to stack voters into districts and to break, up large numbers of voters for the other party. So this practice has deep roots in American history. They're not nearly as effective at it as practitioners are today, because they don't have the kind of sophisticated statistical analysis we have. But politicians are counters, right? They're counting how many votes they can get. So in this moment of extraordinary fervent, local laws mattering a lot, we get some of the first backlashes to what starts to to this increased voter participation. One of the first we see bubbling up in the 1830s starts to have an impact upon the question of how people register to vote or whether they need to register to vote. And this takes us to what the focus of some of these northeastern states backlash, where that focus goes, what it tells us is going, what it's in response to. So some of the first, again, I'm losing the arrow somehow.
Yeah, what happens is if you move it off of it, you just have to move. Yeah, there you go.
So some of the first episodes we see in the 1830s with the early movement response to movements of Irish Catholics in particular into northeastern cities, illustrated here by the attack and burning of a nunnery in Charlestown, Massachusetts, but also including attacks upon other areas in the 1830s, is one moment of a burning of one moment in an anti-Catholic immigrant backlash, focused specifically on the Irish. And this is a period where we see a massive bestseller, The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, purports to be a story of a Protestant girl forced into sexual slavery at a Catholic convent in Montreal. And it's a way of tapping into, it draws in leading figures, preacher Lyman Beecher, Samuel Morse, the inventor and associated with the Morse Code. And it draws in part upon popular fears of the growth of this Irish and non-Protestant group moving in, especially into northeastern cities. And they're moving in and they're voting. Many of the states did not have laws that restricted voting to citizens. And these local elections, as I said, matter a great deal. People are really fired up about keeping control of them. And between 1836 and 1840, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and New York all passed laws that require registration. Now, why does registration matter? And why would they think it would particularly impact immigrant voters? Well, registration, requiring what we really should call pre-registration, requiring you to go on one day to register to vote, and then to go again to vote. A, it increased the literal opportunity cost of voting, right? That it's 2 times, especially during work days. B, it requires a longer period of time in which you can demonstrate a stability of address. So that if you register at one location, have moved to a different district in the months in between, you've self-disfranchised. So that's also specifically aiming to capture a group that, that is marginal or moving among different forms of temporary housing. And 3, that registration requires these immigrants to go to confront representatives of the established order, that the registrars were generally appointed by older political establishments. How had things gone differently? And why is that different when they have to go to, say, a city hall to register? Prior to this, most voting was what we would consider extraordinarily chaotic. People went to the voting place. A few places still did voice voting, but not that many. Many places do things where, ballot has a relationship to the word bullet. They drop stones, they drop balls. Over the 1800s, increasingly, adept groups of popular mobilization and the growth of printing presses and the growth of political parties, people start developing different kinds of ballots. You give out this ballot, you walk up, and different groups of people are pressing you. Take mine, take mine, take mine. In that context, you don't actually have to be able to read anything in English to know which side you're voting for. You go to the person you recognize. It might be, someone from your neighborhood, from a, place of worship, from a club, from a tavern, however you recognize them. In this way, voting is literally a form of identification with a group. You take that ballot, you drop it in, you're done. And that made voting places robust, energetic, out of control, often drunken and violent places that were extremely hard for city elites to control, unlike City Hall and the clerk's office. So that if you can create a pre-registration You eliminate the ability of people to show up on the day of and to vote. You made it harder for them to vote. They've also cut down on people who are new arrivals from voting, and in other ways raised this possibility. You know that this is what they're trying to do because Pennsylvania and New York only apply the law to the city of New York and the city of Pennsylvania. Nobody else has to register. So it's only to capture these places where migrants are coming in. And yet they run out of gas over the 1830s, in part because the relative number of Irish because the number of Irish immigrants is relatively low, and other things, slavery and other things, are emerging. In this context, we start to get, I actually want to skip ahead one and I'll come right back. Here we go. So here we see, this is Samuel Morse and his pamphlet, Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States, this idea that immigrants are not just not as educated, not just not as familiar, but they're particularly tied to some scheme to take over the country. And Lyman Beecher's plea for the West. His plea for the West is that it be saved for Protestants and not turned over to others. So in this, not, something that permits, the growth of voting for others. So in this context, we start to see the rise in the 1830s of this movement, but its ultimate non-success in the 1830s. And then in the 1840s, other things start to happen. One of those, I still can't find the arrow here. Yeah, there we go. One of those, I'm going to go back just a couple.
I'll also tell you, Greg, that the buttons on your keyboard, the arrows.
Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. I should have known that. If you look at these numbers of immigration, you can see that there is a growth in the 1830s as these attacks on the Ursuline convent and other things are spreading, but that in fact, immigration to the United States skyrockets in the middle of the 1840s. And there's a number of reasons for this, but the most direct is the potato famine that starts to spread through Ireland in the summer of 1845. As the blight wipes out half of Ireland's potato crop, almost 1 million islanders, an eighth of the population, die of starvation. 2 million leave for a variety of places, but especially the United States. German Catholics fleeing revolution and warfare there join in this movement, and suddenly the growth of immigration starts to startle those who in the 1830s had kind of written off Morse or Beecher as overly fearful. And then we get in the 1850s a movement that really focuses on how to extend these efforts of the 1830s and to early 1840s and to really make it harder for people to vote. This movement we can connect to things like the American Party, which is formed in 1850 in New York, a city where immigrants outnumber US-born people during this time, as in many other large cities, and where there's active fighting for control of the schools between an active control over public versus parochial schools and about the teaching of the Bible in the schools. The order that he founds, that is founded in New York in 1850 by a man named Charles B. Allen, will eventually become called the Know Nothings, or the American Party. And over 1854, they will accumulate power in the face of other crises, as the Whig Party breaks up in 1854 over the fight over slavery and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Millions of Northerners, especially and also border state, will join this new Know Nothing Party that aims to tamp down the fighting over slavery by focusing upon the fight over immigration. And you can see, some of the platforms, although it's arguable how clear, whether this is a universal platform, but some of the key aspects of Know Nothingism: repeal of all naturalization laws, none but Americans for office, pure American common school, war to the hilt on political Romanism, meaning Catholicism. If you go down to the end, American laws, immigration laws. Many see this as a way to both gain control of the White House and to start to limit the power of immigrants closer to home. And so they back a series, they win 9 state governments, they elect 100 congressmen, a majority of the legislatures in several states, and they start to move to change the law. So the laws that they pass include a re-registration law from New York in 1859, a 1857 law in Massachusetts that requires voters to be able to write their own names, but it grandfathers in those over 60. This will be the exact piece of legislation that Southerners at the end of my talk will be looking toward when they implement Jim Crow. And the reasons why they believe that it's constitutional for them to do so, that Northeastern states had done it not primarily to reach African Americans who are already disfranchised in many states, but to block immigrant white voters, Irish and others. They require longer naturalization waiting periods. They make it harder that you have to present your more paperwork, naturalization papers. Connecticut passes similar laws. 4 New England states prohibit state judges from naturalizing immigrants, which leaves it up to federal judges who find it extremely difficult to do so. And we really then start to see an effort to push forward these 1830s, 1840s registration laws and restrictions on immigration. And then the Civil War happens. And one of the great historians of voting, Alexander Keesar, has said, we've seen the Civil War as if it were the reflection of American history, voter expansion. And in fact, he said, seen in the long run, you can see from 1830 to the 1900s, the 19th century is a period in which in most years, the push is toward retracting the vote. And the Civil War is the anomaly. And why is it an anomaly? It's an anomaly for many reasons. I teach a lot on the Civil War, and we can, I can go on and on about it. But among the reasons it's an anomaly, as you can see in this image, is the participation of 200,000 African American men, only a handful of whom could vote. In a handful of northern states, African American men could vote, but in most northern states and throughout the South, they cannot. You can see here, image of a soldier in uniform is the third one. The other reason that African American, so military service as a crucial aspect of the argument for the vote in the aftermath of the Civil War. The other thing that surfaces over the Civil War in relation to that is how to govern the southern states. And Northern Republicans become convinced that the only way to establish Republican-friendly governments in the South is to enfranchise all African American men, not just soldiers, as Lincoln and others had originally suggested. And that to build up a party base in the South and in reflection of military service, this move to expand the vote. But it also impedes anti-immigrant sentiment. Why is that? Because you have hundreds of thousands of German and US immigrants also in the US Army. After the Civil War, 12 states explicitly enfranchise immigrant aliens who aren't yet citizens. They're what we call declarants. People who say they intend to become citizens can vote in 12 states, a reflection of an expansive vision of immigrant voting. But they don't, not only immigrants who become citizens, but immigrants who express a desire to become citizens. And in this period, in part because of the participation of both immigrants and African Americans in the military process, we see a real growth of an acceptance of wider range of voting. On the ground in the South, and what Julie Saville calls, historian at University of Chicago, calls registration summer, in an echo of 1960s registration summers, US veterans, activists spread across the South, implementing a military reconstruction act, and that allows for the registration of African American men and registering hundreds of thousands of African American men, not women, in the South in order to remake the South in the elections that will create new Southern states in the heart of Reconstruction. In December 1866, about 0.5% of all adult male African Americans in the nation were registered to vote. By December of 1867, it's 80.5%. Why is this registration so effective? In part because of the extraordinary commitment of these registrars, in part because the Army is also helping carry it out and marching out and overseeing the registration themselves in ways that are designed explicitly to make it favorable and open to African Americans. In this fighting, women themselves, many of whom had formed the backbone of the anti-slavery movement, as they see this movement on voting rights for African American men developing, see it also as an opportunity to create voting rights, protection of voting rights for women. In the fights in Congress over the 14th and 15th Amendments, 14th Amendment is passed in 1866, ratified in 1868. 15th passed in 1869, ratified 1870. Women press to see if they can press women's rights onto the agenda of Congress or states that are holding elections like Kansas. Instead, they fail, and in the process, women's rights groups shatter between those that support Black male voting rights anyway and those who argue that it's unjust to enfranchise Black men before women, especially white women. And there's an incredible literature on here. Faye Dudden wrote a really amazing book on how intensely close the connections were. Frederick Douglass had stayed over many times at Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house, and how fraught the break over 1867 was. And the disappointment that the 14th Amendment, which they hoped would press women's suffrage onto the agenda, instead becomes the first amendment to use the word male in the Constitution. And this breaks down particularly in Kansas, which has an election in 1867, not a Southern state, not under Reconstruction. Republicans pushed to have a vote of the populace. Should women be able to vote? Should Black men be able to vote? In the fighting, pictured here, Charles Langston, uncle or great uncle, now I've just lost it. I think uncle of Langston Hughes, maybe, pictured on the right, is an organizer. His brother, John Mercer Langston, will be a leading and legendary figure of civil rights and political organizing in Ohio and Virginia and Washington, D.C. On the left, Susan B. Anthony. The two groups, women's rights and Black rights groups, split in the Kansas referendum, and they both lose. And with this, the division that comes ahead starts to manifest in ways that you've probably seen and can become extremely ugly as it develops. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had been an abolitionist, a close ally of African American voting rights, turns bitterly against the 15th Amendment as it enfranchises Black men, but not women. And you can see her starting to play up. It's a deliberate insult to American womanhood, to put under the iron-heeled peasantry of the old world and the slaves of the new. And if you do not wish the lower orders, women of wealth, education, and refinement, if you do not wish the lower orders of Chinese, Africans, Germans, and Irish to make laws for you and your daughters, wake up. And the suggestion that the 15th Amendment would lead to the rape of women in the South, that in turn leads Douglass to bitterly criticize Stanton and this division between women's suffrage and Black suffrage. So we get a 15th Amendment as it comes out of this remade South. There's a lot of details in politics here I could go into, but we'll try not to because it can take up a lot of the time. In the debates, not only is women's suffrage considered, but Congress people actually consider all kinds of different ways of reaching the vote. The 14th Amendment did not create the vote. It creates an odd incentive to expand the vote, but it doesn't protect the vote directly. 15th Amendment is taken up after Ulysses S. Grant is elected in 1868, passed in 1869, ratified in 1870. In the congressional debates, people bring up, should we just enfranchise, well, should they enfranchise women? But even if it's just men, should they enfranchise all men? What about a block on eliminating, barring men because of education or property or residence or religion? But all of those get voted down. Instead, the 15th Amendment becomes laser-like focused on the idea that what the Constitution protects is not a right to vote, but a right that the right to vote can't be infringed by race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And the reason for this is that as the Republicans in Congress, Republicans, the party of Lincoln, strong Northern support, had created the Reconstruction of the South, that Republicans were unified by this point in the idea that African American men could vote. But Northeastern Republicans are wary of doing things to protect the voting rights of immigrants. And Western Republicans are very wary of the idea that they might extend the vote to Chinese migrants. And the resolution is to focus on these categories, not on education, residency, or not to establish a positive right to vote, that all men have a right to vote unless proven otherwise. The 15th Amendment has and the Reconstruction Acts have an extraordinary impact, as you can see, but it turns out to be not all that long lasting. And we'll come to where that comes from and why it doesn't last, and how that story also helps us to tie back into the question of how voting rights are limited. So as you can see that there's high participation in 1880, although Mississippi already being driven down, even though it's after the canonical or textbook end of Reconstruction in 1876 to 77, but you can also see where it's going over the 80s and 90s. We think of this as a period of large-scale intimidation of the voters box presented here. You can see the boxes, the holding of the ballot, and the ways that these can be sites of intimidation and brutality. And we can also see Southern states as they're figuring out, as white Southern Democrats regain control, they start to try to figure out how is it that they can restrict the voting, and where do they look? They look to the north. They look to registration laws. One thing they do is they simply force everyone to re-register. And you can see this experimented with today, that the simplest way to drive down voting is to say we're clearing the registration book and everybody has to come in and register anew. The second way is they concentrate power, like in the South Carolina law, in the hands of an individual registrar who has huge power and discretion to decide who counts as local, who they recognize, who has got a long-term residency. They double the residency requirements so that tenants can't vote. Just by this is before the heart of disfranchising that's coming in the 1890s, the Republican vote in South Carolina, which is largely, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly African American. In 1880, it's 58,000. In 1888, it's 13,000. In other words, a great deal of the work of disfranchisement they accomplish before they go into the heart of Jim Crow. And how do they do it? By learning from the ways that northern states have disfranchised immigrants through registration. They also draw upon long-standing practices in England and carried over into most colonies of disfranchisement of felons. But the difference that they start implementing in the South is they take this felon disfranchisement, which had long existed, and they take it that felon disfranchisement had long existed for a handful of what were called infamous crimes. Rape, treason. In some states, even murder wasn't an infamous crime. A murderer who could vote. What they do is they take that practice of felon disfranchisement and dramatically expand the number of people who are covered by it. Every state except for Texas expands them, and they expand them trying to tie them particularly to crimes that they, reading the stats as well as they can, that they associate with African Americans. And then to start a regime of arrests on petty thefts meant to get at people this way. So you see someone barred from registering for stealing 3 oranges in Ocala, Florida, or a button or a hog. Richmond has, by this period, is excluding 2,100 African-American men for felonies. And at the same time, the push for voter expansion is fading in the North. Massachusetts and other states seeing once again a rising tide of immigration after the end of the Civil War. and a movement of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, particularly over the 1870s, starts to put in new registration laws. And these registration laws start to drive down voting in the North as well. So that in Massachusetts, stricter registration laws start to drive down voting by as much as 50%. Other northern states start following similar things. Providence, Rhode Island, site of a growing factory system. Property qualifications keep 80% of men from voting, adult men, in city elections. New Jersey puts in registration in 1866 and 1870. California in 1878 purges registered voters in San Francisco to drop down to 54% of adult men being on the rails. And a growing number of Northeasterners look to combine their critique of immigrant voting, use their critique of immigrant voting to soften their stances against disfranchisement in the South. You see this in Charles Francis Adams, that he says that they're at war against the government of ignorance and vice, and that stitching together the efforts of industrialists and others to disfranchise immigrants in the North and West with white Southern planters looking to disfranchise African Americans.
So
yeah.
Greg, I'm going to pause you just for a moment. We've got a couple of questions that are they're starting to queue up, and give you a chance to respond to them. But I also want to remind all of our participants tonight that we are recording tonight's session, and you will have access to this. It's a dense and complex topic, but I think what you're doing, Professor, is really cutting through some key themes that many of our participants can then take to their students, and that includes maybe viewing parts of this webinar. So I do want to tell everyone, especially you, Jennifer Jolly, that we will have a recording of this available within a couple of days. But there are a couple other questions that have popped up, and I know a lot of people are really curious about the genesis story, the origin story of the backwards N and the know nothing. We're going to save that to the very end, so I'll get to that. But in terms of what you're talking about now, Brian Engel asks if you can clarify what it means to double the residency requirement. What did you mean by that?
Sorry, I was rushing past there. So what I mean by that is that if states or cities would say that someone had to be in residence for 6 months, say, before an election in order to be eligible to vote, a quick way of making it harder for people to vote, but not seeming to do so by race or other protected category, would be to say you have to be in residence for a year. And tenants who are turning over apartments then, or moving from farm to farm in farming areas, would then disfranchise themselves by moving. So if you can extend that residency time, you can reach more and more people who are what they call the floating population. Does that make sense?
I think it does. It certainly does to me. And Brian, Brian says he absolutely does. So I've got a couple other questions I'm going to save to the very end, including yours, okay, Brendan. But I do know that the Australian ballot's a big part of what you'd like to share tonight. My job is to keep us on time. We've got about 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay, so then this is in some ways the climax or the low light. So in 1888, you've got this movement across the South to restrict voting rights for African Americans, and a nascent movement across northern states to restrict immigration. And yet neither has quite come fully to fruition. And then something odd happens in 1888, and that is that the Democratic governor of New York goes to political war against the Democratic president of the country, Grover Cleveland, also a New Yorker. And in a battle over control over patronage and of the New York Democratic Party, the Democratic governor of New York, David Hill, goes back to that system of how ballots are distributed that we talked about. That you go to the polls and somebody's there handing you a ballot, and you know you're affiliated with his party, his place in the world, his church, his neighborhood, his club, however you identify. Well, David Hill does a tricky thing. He publishes a ballot that has his name as governor, Democrats in every other office, and leaves President blank. What that means is across New York City, voters come, they see that they're Democrats, they pick up the ballot, they vote, they end up voting for the Democrat for governor, every other Democrat, and not the Democrat for president. Grover Cleveland ends up David Hill gets elected governor, re-elected governor of New York. Grover Cleveland loses the state. And despite winning a majority of the popular vote, loses the election in the Electoral College. Not a majority, but a plurality of the popular vote, loses the election in the Electoral College. What does this mean? This creates fury across reformers in the Northeast. And they see in 1888, this is a form of trickery, including those who did not share a political party, who had floated between parties or in other ways expressed their political independence. But a group of reformers in Boston and New York start looking to say, how can we solve this? And they look to what I call the Deep South, Australia, to an innovation there in voting called the Australian ballot, which meant that the government publishes the ballot lists the approved choices, and then you as the voter have to select among them. What this means is it automatically disfranchises people who cannot read English, unless there are translations, which there would not have been at the time. Prior to this, if you knew who you were affiliated with, you could take a pre-printed ballot from that person. Now you get a government printed ballot that lists the name of all the candidates. In many states, it doesn't list their party. And if you don't know, your vote becomes meaningless. The next year, Massachusetts passes it. By 1892, most of the states in the country have passed it. Massachusetts turnout drops from 55% to 41%, Vermont from 69% to 53%. The estimate, I'm not a statistician, is that this alone drives down voting across the country by a little more than 8% of the vote. I mean, many people complain about this immediately as an almost perfect way to make it hard to destroy people's interest in voting. Quickly, voting places become long lines and boring. Annoying and boring instead of riotous, sometimes drunken and violent, but riotous, engaged, in places of, of sort of community interaction, of something much more bureaucratic. In New York, voter participation had been 90% in the 1880s. It's down to 57% by 1920. Not all of that is the Australian ballot, but it's a part of it. And it's a part of what Alexander Keesar called the disfranchisement of the North, why the northern states drop, even if not at the same rate as the southern states. And then there's something else that happens. That same election of 1888 sends a Republican to the White House, but with a minority of the popular vote. And there, Republicans look ahead to 1890 and the census, and they think, this is our last chance. And they take on a series of bold efforts to save their political power. One of which is that they usher in 5 states. They have control of Congress and the White House, but looking ahead, they think they're about to become a permanent minority party. They rush 5 states into Congress in order to stack Congress, the Senate, and the Electoral College for themselves. They, in other ways, pass a series of important bills, and they try to pass for the last time until the 1950s, a wide-ranging Civil Rights Act. It's called the Lodge Voting Rights Bill, or the Force Bill, that would have put, using this toehold they have on power, they passed through one house and it hangs up in the other, a bill that would have put all congressional elections in the South under federal supervision in order to protect Black voting rights. They lose in the clock. Basically, the time runs out in the session as they're trying to pass a series of bills. Southern politicians, as well as some Northern moderates compromising with them, kick the can down the road until time runs out. One of the Southern senators, James George, comes home from that, and he says 2 things. A, the North has really figured out how to make voting hard on immigrants, but B, if we're not careful, Republicans are going to step in and protect Black voting rights, and the time to act is now. And in the aftermath of the Republicans' failure to pass this voting rights bill in 1890, immediately Mississippi begins holding its disfranchisement convention, spurred on by this senator who has seen what he thinks is the future of the future of protection of civil rights in the North. Mississippi that year passes a bill that lengthens the amount of time your residency requirement, how long you have to live somewhere to vote, puts in a poll tax, a literacy test, expands the felonies of disfranchisement, adds the Australian ballot, explicitly promising that this is in order to create white supremacy, which becomes the motto of many Southern state Democratic parties, and to establish white control over the governments of the South for generations. In Mississippi, Black registration falls from 190,000 to 9,000, but many whites also don't register. And in fact, many white Democrats are happy with that if they can keep poorer whites out. And overall registration in Mississippi, I meant to click to this slide before, overall registration in Mississippi drops significantly from 70% in 1870 to 50% in the 1880s to 15% in the 1900s. Almost every other state follows suit in copying this Mississippi plan. The Democrats in Congress start repealing those parts of federal voting rights once the Supreme Court accepts the constitutionality of this on the grounds that Southern states have copied forms from the North. Over the next 20 years, by 1908, it spreads to every Southern state, although it's only partially implemented in some of the border states, to go back to the question. In Louisiana, there are 130,000 African-American voters registered in 1896. By 1910, there are 730. As you can see, in 1880, every Southern state had at least 40% Black turnout, and several had 80%. By 1900, only one state has 40%. By 1912, every Southern state has 3% or lower Black turnout, and some of the numbers of the individual states. And it's in the aftermath of this that we start to see the extraordinary, and it's in creating this that we see these extraordinarily racist campaigns. The images that you see here are from North Carolina and their mass media campaign to play upon fears of African American strength, virility, power, and to create what they call a white supremacy campaign to drive Black voters from the polls. By 1920, nationwide voting as a percentage has dropped by a third. So dramatic, staggering transformations in the South, but a drop of 1/3 nationwide. And it's those two processes together that I've been trying to suggest help us understand why voter participation in the US goes from leading the world in the 1800s to trailing most of the comparable nations by the late 20th century. And why even after just the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Acts attack the Southern exception, the use of tools specifically designed for African Americans in the South, and even after African American participation in the South approaches and in some places surpasses participation in the rest of the country, the entire country is working on a lower level of voter participation than it had been as a percentage in the 1800s. And that leads us back to the tools that survived the attack on Jim Crow, the things that still shape how we vote, how we register, how difficult it is to register, what documents are required at registration, how difficult it is to vote, what it means to make voting extremely annoying or inconvenient or lengthy, as opposed to easy or a party as it had been in the 19th and late 18th century. And how those forms of registration, as well as how the form of the ballot that we use, continue to define the United States' relatively low voter participation today. I see some questions ticking on the side, so let me kick it back to Andy to select among them, and then I'm glad to keep taking questions for as long as we have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. And I also want to thank Lee Holder, who is a former Teacher Advisory Council member, who points out that in our American class lesson toolbox, we have several lessons on the making of the African American identity, which might be relevant to the session tonight. But we do have a bunch of questions here, and I think I'd like to start with the let's see. I'm going to go all the way back to, you know what, I think I'd like to go to that question that many folks had, and I'm going to use Tammy Sweeney, who's in Pennsylvania, to summarize 4 or 5 different requests for this, and that is the some kind of origin story for the backwards letter N in the Know Nothings, because Tammy notes that she's seen it used among modern militia groups, conspiracy activists, etc. And I'm wondering, you sort of concluded with this direct tie into a more contemporary lens. That might be one way to insert that. So what do you know about the backwards N and the Know Nothing language?
I'm one of the things that I emphasize to my students is if they ask a good question, and I don't know, I will say I don't know. So I actually don't know exactly what that was meant to signify in the 1850s. It is interesting that the idea that it's recurring now, and it would be certainly conceivable that groups are looking now to the Know Nothings and others as forerunners, an American Party, as a forerunner of contemporary movements. But why some Know Nothings reverse some ends, I don't know.
Got it. Thank you for being transparent about that. Although I apologize to all of our participants who were waiting for about a half an hour for you to give them the
secret answer, the big reveal.
Tell us what you think, Professor Davis. Tell us what you think about the modern electoral college. Brennan brings that up. What do you think in terms of its relevance, the impact if we were to dismiss it somehow, particularly in the context of what you've shared tonight? What are your feelings about the electoral college?
Personally, I think that it has outlived its usefulness at best, and that the range, the abilities that we have to count votes and to disseminate that information make it no longer necessary if it ever were necessary. And I do think that it has odd impacts in terms of driving down participation in states that are either overwhelmingly Republican or Democratic, in the sense of people calculating that their vote doesn't matter. As well as creating an imbalance in the relatively small states that are overrepresented in the Electoral College. There are some interesting movements out there, one of which is based in Marin County in the North Bay of the Bay Area, which are aiming to supplant the Electoral College without a constitutional amendment, what's called the Popular Vote Compact. To get enough states to commit that they will pledge their electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote, if at least 270 electoral votes are committed by different states. So to create a compact that they would all agree. There's a lot of debates about there about how enforceable it would be, how sustainable it would be in a moment of crisis. If there were divergence between the popular vote victor and the person who would win under the prior way of counting electoral votes. I certainly understand the shyness around issues of how difficult it is to transform the Constitution. But I do often indicate to my classes that one of the striking things about 19th century life, not even just in the Civil War era, which is an anomaly, is how bold people were. I mean, even those 1889 Republicans, they looked at a map that wasn't in their favor and they changed it and created 5 states, cut Dakota in 2. The Republicans in the Civil War era expanded the Supreme Court, retracted it. There are many hundreds of proposed constitutional amendments in the 1860s, not just the 3 that passed. And there are efforts there of people to really articulate how broad systemic changes could be considered. And I do worry that if we've fallen into a complacency or a proceduralism, where because it's hard to change the system, we're stuck with the system, that feeds into people's doubts about the efficacy of politics. So I would personally rather see politicians pushing for difficult and maybe even unrealistic to pass ways of re-articulating how the country should work, rather than talking about why the system we have can't possibly deliver upon things that people would like to see. It's amazing to me in retrospect that in 2009, when the Democrats had control of both houses in the presidency and 60 senators, that Washington, D.C. wasn't made a state. For all that people talk about the moderation of various 19th century figures, there's no question to me that the most moderate Republican of the 19th century would have immediately come out of that situation with several states. But it bespeaks a kind of nervousness about any change that you see across the political spectrum, so that you see even candidates who call for broad systemic change do things like defend the filibuster. I can certainly understand defenses of the filibuster or the Electoral College, but it would be interesting to have more robust conversations about which of these institutions we should keep and which it's worth making the difficult, long effort to undo.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And I'm actually going to take a question that Jedediah Gist Anderson has asked and sort of wrap it into a comment that I just heard you make, which was, I think what you said, Greg, was sort of got to this notion that that today we can be so much more precise with our data and our technology that the Electoral College in some ways might not be as relevant. Jedediah is asking about gerrymandering. So I'm going to combine those two and ask for you to comment on the ways in which the digital landscape, the tools that we have at our both advantage and disadvantage now, are significantly changing both voter suppression as well as the voting landscape in general. How do you see just technology, generally speaking, changing all of these conversations under our feet?
Well, the two things here I'm drawing on friends in political science who study contemporary electoral law and electoral practices in a way that I don't from my own research. But the two things I hear them talking about, one is the use of software programs and gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is an old practice in American life. But the ability to break down in very minute ways how to gerrymander successfully has been transformed even in the last, since the 2008 or 2009, as people began to prepare for the 2010 census. And this is an argument that a number of political scientists and election lawyers have been making, that even though the Supreme Court has generally stayed out of gerrymandering, that what if we're facing a scenario in which people can become so adept at it that the political system can't respond to it? The traditional argument has been that the Supreme Court should let the voters fix those problems. But is it possible, because of our ability to get really down in the nitty-gritty of the numbers, using different software analyses, that politicians could fix a gerrymander in a way that the voters could not overturn? And you do see this in this way that you've seen it, what they call the efficiency gap, in the ways that state legislators have been adept at taking a majority of votes for one party and turning it into a minority of seats in the legislature. So that's one. The other, I think, is the impact of some artificial intelligence tools and others in purging registration. So we've talked about, one of the themes that I've had is that registration is secretly the place that voter disfranchisement has happened in American history, even though it sort of sits off stage. And there's no doubt that in a number of states, and there's news articles today about an effort nearly averted, that there are purges of registration, some of which have bases in older purges of dead voters or voters who have moved. But because of the artificial intelligence they're using, they're creating seemingly fair systems that end up purging many enfranchised voters. And once purged of registration, if they show up at the polls, they may find it very difficult to restore that registration in time. So those are two areas where I think technology. The flip side of that goes to something else that political scientists have been studying, which is how well do the set of laws passed in the last, say, 9 years by state legislatures to discourage voting, how well are those working? And there's actually a lot of mixed evidence about this. That voter turnout has stayed high. 2018 saw extraordinarily high midterm voter turnout, even though the landscape of laws was tightening down on voter participation. And one of the answers to this has been the inverse of that technology question, that people are much more knowledgeable and much more fired up. And so there's one argument that at least at this level, a lot of the state level laws have fired people up to participate to keep themselves from being disfranchised. And that could be true, but I remain worried based upon the past history of a problem of a basic problem in voting law, which is that if someone can successfully disfranchise once, they've changed the electorate, passed a series of laws that discourage voting once, they've changed the electorate that'll weigh in on those laws. And so it's true that it's hard to see the direct impact of more recent laws, even ones that look bad on their face. But it's also true that we might not see that impact until it's almost too late to go back and fix them. Mm-hmm. So I've been much more interested in some of the efforts to make automatic registration, things that make it much easier for people to participate. I saw people posted questions about weekend voting. That's something that's been experimented with in other parts of the world. Or mail-in balloting like you have in Oregon, though it adds a lot of time to the counting process.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I was going to end tonight with sort of a personal question. I heard you mention that you have 2 daughters in middle school. I've got my daughter is in second year in college. My son is in high school, and I was going to ask you, as both a professional, a professor, and a parent, whether you're optimistic or not. And you answered that a little bit by saying you were worried, but I'm gonna frame it to you anyway. Are you optimistic?
So I am worried. I would say I'm worried, but not hopeless. I do think it's interesting to see the extraordinary swell of participation and engagement with politics across the political spectrum over the last couple of years, and some signs that that might endure. And it's interesting, I asked my classes, I do a little blind poll of my biggest classes, which tend to have non-majors, about whether they're optimistic or pessimistic about the state of the country. And after there had been a few years where their pessimism was definitely winning, and the class that I'm teaching this fall was the first one where optimism was sort of back in the lead. So I'm hopeful that these 18 and 19-year-olds are the canary in the coal mines and seeing a burst of energy about how to revitalize political participation and rethink some of these questions. But I would also, to sadly undercut my own optimism, when I do the same question for the history classes, the students who study history tend to be much more pessimistic than some of the students in things like engineering and other fields. Yeah. Whether that's because they have a broader sense of what's possible in the country by looking at the past and the kind of past we talked about today, or because more of them are 3 or 4 years older, and that even being a very small generation gap, I don't know. So I would be too much to say I'm optimistic, or I'm warily optimistic about the future, that the outcome of this will be a conflict that leads to better voting participation and rights rather than less. But the other is definitely possible.
Professor, thank you so much for leading the conversation tonight. We appreciate all your resources, your PowerPoint, and your insights to this complex topic. And I'm going to push for optimism only because of all the teachers who are in this room. And
that's right. That's right.
We're going to fire it up. So thanks again, Greg, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you and all the work that you all do.
And I want to thank all of our participants tonight for joining us for tonight's session. Again, please follow the National Humanities Center on social media, both Facebook and Twitter, in order to see upcoming activities, initiatives, and programs. And I do hope to see you at our next session, which will be October 22nd. We'll be joined by Patrick Balls from the University of North Carolina at Asheville. I think this is the first time we've had a professor of mathematics in our humanities webinars. He will be speaking about the marriage of mathematics and poetry. In just a moment, I'm going to open a survey, and that survey will then give you access to the certification for tonight. It's going to pop up as a test, and we would appreciate you taking it afterwards, and we always use those evaluations to inform our future work. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. We hope to see you again at our next webinar session, and I hope you have a great day at school tomorrow. Good night.